Thank you, Tom. This is Eric Toline sitting in for Ivan Berger, who normally sits in for Martin Gersten, who isn't here tonight to begin with. With me tonight, John Karlson of the KRC Corporation in Malvern, Long Island, and Reuben Guss, president of Argus-X Electronics. They make the Argus-X loudspeakers. We were talking about, just prior to airtime, Mr. Karlson's loudspeakers being used at the World's Fair. John, why don't you tell us a little more about that?
Well, currently our enclosures are being used in the Ford exhibit at the World's Fair, which is the largest one there, and also the GE. In the Ford exhibit, they're going to have the animatronics by Walt Disney.
Oh yes, I remember reading about that.
These animated figures with associated sound, and I suppose they go in for spectacular and whatnot. The same is true in GE. I understand they're going to exhibit thunder and lightning and everything else that is the fancy of the real hi-fi bug.
Well, will this be
they're using our the largest enclosures for that purpose, together with the Electro Voice 15 TRX speaker.
Well, will this be the type of coverage that you have here in your brochure, the ceiling mount?
No, these are much larger units than the ceiling units shown there. They're the full-fledged speakers, enclosures for 15-inch speakers, and they're designed to give the full dynamics that the human ear can tolerate, plus the complete range of hearing, from the lowest bass tones to that of the highest, naturally.
Well, that's quite a pat on the back to have them choose your speakers.
Well, it's a strange thing that GE is having RCA install these speakers, and RCA is buying them from us.
Reuben, how about you? Any of your Argus speakers being used at the World's Fair?
No, my speakers are designed for music, not for thunder and lightning.
Well,
although I did try running a railroad train through my living room the other day. It rearranged the furniture. Good bass response.
You mean the furniture was rearranged after you got through? Or?
Yeah. This is living sound.
Well, I don't know if you want the 529 through your living room every evening. Reuben, you claim that your speakers, I've seen your ads in the New York Times stating to bring your speaker down and match it up against the Argus-X for a A-B comparison. Has this always worked in your favor?
Yes,
people who
as a general rule. Of course, you always run into the problem of individual taste, which frequently has very little to do with high fidelity. When people become accustomed to jukeboxes, they resent a live orchestra.
True.
So I give them certain suggestions. This is hypnosis. No, seriously, it is not. I suggest to them that they ought to listen to the instruments, see whether or not the instruments are reproduced with authenticity. Then in the bass region, can they hear the individual instruments separated, the bowing of bass fiddles, etc. In many speakers that I compare them to, I can't dare mention names for fear of offending Vulture and others, but...
Why not? I mentioned names on here. Go ahead.
Well, I demonstrated
this is strictly
against
your opinion.
An AR,
AR2,
A, and then an AR3, and then a KLH4, which I regard as a very fine speaker, the KLH4. At any rate, all of them, and any speakers they will bring in, do not show up favorably in a test to delineate the instruments of the orchestra. They drop out of sight. And it's the job of a transducer to recreate the signal it's getting, not to lose half of it. So we get the bass instruments very clearly delineated, and when there are fiddles bowing on the bottom end, you hear them. where you do not hear them in most other speakers.
Well, which speaker have you found to be fairly close to yours?
The KLH-4, a very fine little instrument.
Well, what price ranges do your speakers run? Do you have more than one model? Do you...
Well, we're getting a little model that's $75, which I'll put up against any small speaker, again, for delineating instruments of the orchestra with authenticity. They sound like the instruments ought to sound. One test I'm very fond of is Björling. I was very fond of this man, and he had an unusual voice, which was difficult to capture by a loudspeaker. Voice is a tough test, so is piano, the transients. I'd play this for people who are familiar with Björling, who'd heard him in person. And the Argus-X speaker most closely approximates the live voice.
I'd like to ask you one question. You talk about piano. Do you have any particular records that you use as a standard, as to compare your speakers to others?
Well, if you have a few weekends, we'll discuss records.
No, in particular.
I try to get something cut to the RIAA curve. You can't always get that.
Yeah. Well, any record in particular that you favor, that you would recommend for someone to use to demonstrate a speaker system?
Well, if I'd known you were going to ask, I'd have brought a list. I know Peter and the Wolf, which is a London reproduction. Many people disapprove of the interpretation. You have Ogden Nash. Funny.
Well, you're not really interested in the interpretation. You're interested in the sonics.
No, but you do get some pretty good stuff in the bottom end, and it's pretty well balanced.
Yeah.
Most speakers do not reproduce with authenticity, or do not reveal the instruments on the bottom in this record. But there are many records. I recently heard a Columbia record of Stravinsky, conducting Stravinsky, Firebird Suite. I shouldn't mention it on the phone because I want to get my hands on it. By the time I get to the shops, they'll be all gone. But there was a record with phenomenal transients on the bottom, wide range.
There's one particular record that is a favorite of mine. It's on Capitol, and it's the Swan Lake Ballet Theater Orchestra under the direction of Joseph Levine. And it is the Dance Espanol, which is the first band on the second side. I advise you to pick it up, if you can, and just use that for high-frequency transient response, because they use at least 15 or 20 tambourines, and you can actually count each time the little clickers on each tambourine are snapped together. This is probably the greatest high-frequency sonics without any distortion
I'll write that down.
that I've ever heard.
Sounds unheard of.
Yes, Shelley Mann, Jack Marshall,
use that.
very good.
Within 1 decibel of the RIAA curve.
That's the one that
Flat from
Joe Grado recommends.
1,000 to 1,100 cycles. Reasonably flat the rest of the way.
John, when you test your speakers out, do you use any particular record or any favorites?
Well, we use an assortment of records ranging from the original pipe organ records to piano and so on. And I've used a full gamut of what we have available. Recently haven't stuck with any particular recordings, but we try to give our units a complete test in every type of musical rendition. You mentioned before that we reproduce thunder and lightning and so on, because
I haven't tried that.
Well, if you want something pretty close to that.
Now we've used that for demonstration, just to exhibit the dynamic range of our speakers. And the thing that you mentioned before about several of these speakers dropping out is a point which I've tried to bring out in many discussions, that if you have a low efficiency speaker, it is natural that it will operate at a certain point. In other words, say this suspension has a certain amount of resistance in its motion. Now it'll take just so much voltage to get that moving. Below that voltage level, the speaker won't move. Now you get a complex transients having low and high level transients or dynamics. The low level dynamics will drop out. It's because they go below a level where the speaker no longer moves. Similarly, if you get a high level transient, the sound is likely to be muffled, and it is characteristic of many low frequency speakers. Say,
give an example.
Cymbal, take a crash of a cymbal. Now, very frequently, you lose the entire thrill and impact of a cymbal sound.
The timbre on the high end?
The timbre on the high end is lost because the speaker is incapable of creating the drive to recreate this transient. And so we, although some of our tests may appear to be extreme to the layman, we make these tests with the records that have these fantastic dynamics in order to test the ability of our units to go to the limit. And this is what really creates the beauty and the presence of a speaker, is this ability to give the complete dynamic range.
The dynamic range, the differences between loudness and softness for our educated radio audience, insulting their intelligence. Well, I very frequently, deliberately, not only play them very loudly to demonstrate that you do not get a headache, and at the same time, very softly, where other speakers lose virtually all the subject matter. This will reproduce bass, mid-range, and top.
I'd like to make one little comment. This is the Hi-Fi Workbench on WNCN-FM 104.3. If you have any questions pertaining to high fidelity, and particularly loudspeakers, you can call us at Closet 2 0870. We have two very young, pretty ladies answering the telephones tonight.
My wife is going to resent that bit of information.
Well, my wife won't.
She's one of them at the switchboard?
Because she's right behind us at the glass.
Oh.
We're expecting, I have been told, Bob Ajay. In the meantime, this is Eric Toline with John Karlson of KRC Corporation and Reuben Guss of Argus-X Electronics, and we're talking about loudspeakers, what they can and cannot do, naming some names. There are two phones. Thank you for calling. You were talking about low frequencies being dispersed. I had a refresher course about an hour or so ago in a pipe organ. We just came from the music hall, and they have this monstrous pipe organ there, and some of the notes this chap hit must have been down around eight cycles. You just felt them, you didn't hear them. And after I hear these people taking these King of Instrument records, and you say, well, listen to that, it's such a fantastic difference in the depth and the fullness and the openness of sound. When you listen to something like that, even just the massive size of the organ compared to the size of your largest loudspeaker, we've got quite a way to go if you want to really look for realism. But the mind,
looking for the bottom of the pipe organ.
The bottom of the pipe organ.
Maybe one record in 10,000 in your
That's
collection.
really
well.
True.
We actually took a recording of the music hall organ, and then recreated that in a high school auditorium, and the realism was just fantastic. We had two of our units doing it.
It should go along well with
the thing that strikes me very funny is the fact that most of the record companies today are using the Teldec cutter heads, stereo heads, or the Westrex. And Teldec, which is the Neumann people, give you specifications on their cutter head, their stereo head, of 30 to 16,000 cycles. And people are claiming bottom-end response down to DC and top-end response out to light. somewhere, and I spoke to a recording engineer, a fellow who cuts records, and I asked him, I said, what are they putting on records today? He said, you're getting your top end about 17 kc, your low end down with really pushing to about 25 cycles.
That's right.
And he said there is no useful information above or below that.
That's correct.
On the records, and yet you can open up any catalog to any component and it says, well, we go plus or minus 1/8 of a dB from 1 cycle to 1 megacycle. Yet the comparison bandwidth between what is on the record at your source and what your equipment will reproduce is such a great difference. It represents such a small area. And for myself, I can't really see that there should be this great overlap between source and playback equipment.
Yeah. Well, this brings up a classic argument. In other words, presumably the response is between two limits, specific limits. Therefore, the equipment only need be designed for those limits. However, if you have an amplifier, for example, and you cut it off at 20 cycles, I've actually demonstrated this at one of the hi-fi shows. I took an amplifier that was designed to cut off at 20 cycles, and then I took a Marantz, which is designed to be down to 5 cycles. Well, we could hear an additional octave of bass. It was readily apparent.
Well, what source were you using for this?
We were using records, and
in my opinion, it had nothing to do with the specs of the amplifiers, because a well-designed amplifier cutting off at 20 will give you much better bass than a badly designed one going down to 5, with much more energy and cleaner and tighter, better transients.
Well, that's a very good
Take
point.
the Neumann cartridge, very conservative specs, and yet you get phenomenal authenticity and separation of instruments.
This I've heard about the Neumann. I've heard some other things which had nothing to do with its reproducing capabilities.
I'm using a Grado, it happens.
So am I. I happen to like it.
well, our units can go down to those limits now. When special recordings have been made with limits down to 16 cycles and so on,
Very special.
we have been able to reproduce them.
Well, my speakers do it too. Hunter College, Gillette Hall in the Bronx is using 2 of my X5 speakers.
Are those the largest ones that you make?
No. I'd like to discuss that a little later.
All right.
We're working on new custom speakers, exploiting a patented principle I have, which will be effectively like having 200 cubic feet of air in a cabinet, only air that moves sympathetically with the cone, not inert. But I'll discuss that a little later. I have many other things in my mind. I just got another letter from Lester Cogg of Cogg Laboratories.
They make
He's
the
developing the crystal
tuner.
control tuner. He's just concluded the development of a solid-state amplifier. That's a euphemism, radio audience, for transistors. You know, these $6 transistor radios, only you've got to call it solid-state in order to get 300 and 400. But I respect Lester Cogg. I think he's probably come up with a fine amplifier. He tried him with our shelf speakers, and he used to use KLH4s. Again, the closest competition I know. He's using Argus-X. He just purchased another 8 speakers, and he's delighted with the sound. I'll be publishing this letter soon.
You're going to be disappointed sometime. You'll put the R's next to yours.
Well, stay tuned
Oh,
for
I don't mind.
bloodletting tonight, folks.
I think you have a very impressive baffle, and I'm glad you have it down at the Ford show. I can just picture these Fords riding through this Karlson enclosure. That is on a recording.
The gentleman
No,
just
I
missed
always
Ed
loved
Gosher
your
by 1
enclosure.
week.
You know, I used to. I remember when I first got into high fidelity, this gentleman has been in a good deal longer than I have. I was most impressed with the Karlson enclosure and that Jensen triax.
This
I was
is when
most
I
impressed.
first started in high fidelity.
Still a good combination.
Yeah.
I remember Karlson enclosures. You used to be in Brooklyn, if I'm not mistaken. And I still remember the triangular shaped slot in the front. People,
Please watch him.
this is the greatest you want to get another octave of bass out of a speaker that doesn't have it, put it in the Karlson enclosure. And for some reason I never got
Produce it. You don't have to reproduce bass. Produce bass.
Produce bass.
I thought I'd get him out, his anger. He smiled.
Well, Reuben, about the Argus speakers that you're talking about, do you find that there are people who will originally buy the Argus-X speakers and then hear something else and prefer that to yours?
Yes, they generally hear a bigger Argus and prefer it. But they've put the Argus, the X5, which we sell for $225, and that's for $300. They've put it up against $800 Bozak and other big systems and preferred the Argus as being more musical, producing what it sounds audibly to be more definition in the bass, cleaner transients. Put them up against Jim Lansing's. I hope my attorney is listening.
You've touched the soft spot with me.
And the top screams in some of these other speakers, and violins sound like they're in steel cases. The Argus speakers have a very sweet top end, very natural. Violins sound like violins. Incidentally, there's a nice practice by some manufacturers of the live music where psychology enters into this very, very strongly. You play a few violins, and then you reproduce them on a speaker. You can do this with virtually any speaker, but I defy them to use speakers that, or rather live music that has good transients, piano. I defy them to try this test against a live piano.
Well, as Ed Vilcher said last week when we were talking...
Or a band or an orchestra, or drums with transients. Try it. Organ pedals, you don't need transients.
Anything with dynamics is difficult to reproduce, and you need
transients.
You really need efficiency and
the
ability to move air.
If I'm mistaken in mentioning what Ed said, I apologize. But it was his contention that it is very difficult to reproduce something like the guitar as he had at the Hi-Fi show last September. He quoted some figures that most of the audience couldn't tell when they went from tape to live and back again, dependent upon where they sat.
Sure, I've got a tape recording on that is so shrill it actually sounds live on an AR. I've got such tapes. Peaked about 6 or 10 decibels above 2,000
Are we going to get calls from AR owners?
I'm going to be sued. No, I'm not saying that he deliberately peaks those tapes, but it's possible in certain environments I've heard AR3s sound very good. I have a friend who owns them, and I resent it.
Jan Sergula, who does most of the recording, I'm almost certain, for Ed on these, doesn't peak these tapes. He has a little black box there with lights. Here come some questions.
Yeah.
That shows 0 dB deviation and up in half dB steps. Thank you. From 0 up to 3 dB for each channel, and these lights blink on and off as he balances out his levels. And I don't think he purposely peaks them. I don't think he's
I don't think he does
fool anyone.
In all seriousness, I mentioned the psychology of this. If you delay even 1 minute, you won't tell much difference, really, and you can easily be fooled. The same test run with an AR, I am certain, would fool the same number of audience in the audience as 3/4 of the speakers now available in the market. This is a challenge. 3/4 of the speakers will convince or just as completely confound the audience because of the psychology of not knowing which. You can be fooled. But if you have a direct, instantaneous AB, maybe not so readily, or difficult instruments with tough transients like the bass notes of your piano, crashing chords, try to fool them there.
Symbol.
John, a question had arisen before about the Karlson enclosures. Someone had asked about an explanation of the Karlson enclosure. I myself would be interested in hearing about it.
Well, the Karlson enclosure was designed primarily to overcome a basic difficulty in the reproduction of sound with loudspeakers. Ordinarily, a loudspeaker depends upon its size to get air in motion. And in order to have the dynamics that we're speaking of, and the complete dynamic range, which exists not only for the highest level sound, but the weakest level, we have to be able to move air very, very readily. And in order to do that, you have to have not just an ordinary speaker radiating to air, because it's very, very inefficient in doing so. It just floats at low frequencies. This direct radiator loudspeaker just floats through the air and actually doesn't succeed in getting any great amount of air in motion. What we do is provide a coupling device between the speaker and the air, which acts as an acoustic transformer. In other words, it might be analogous to a gear train in a car. That is, we have energy at one level in the engine. We have to transmit it to energy at another rate in the wheels. This steering mechanism enables us to do that. And we get the tight coupling between the speaker and the air through this device. It acts, in other words, almost like an air pump. And instead of having the speaker radiate directly into the air, it radiates into a special type of cavity which I have invented. And this cavity, in a sense, entraps the air so that it creates a greater pressure against the speaker than normal. In this way, when the speaker is acting against a greater pressure, it's able to get more air into motion. And this is really the secret of what we do. Now, the special shape that we use is something very, very unique in acoustics. As far as I know, it is the only acoustic device which is capable of being either universally resonant at all frequencies or non-resonant at any frequency. It's a true transformer.
It's like a politician.
You might say that. But it is capable, in other words, of taking the energy from the speaker in a much more efficient manner than ordinarily. The average speaker might have about 5% efficiency. Some might be as low as 1%. Ours range up to about 40%, speaking conservatively. Now, this is a fantastic difference. When you take complex transients, such as you might have in an orchestra, well, every instrument is clearly defined. You can pick out every single instrument in that orchestra.
Sounds like an artist.
Well, undoubtedly, you try to attain efficiency.
I do it a different way. I have efficiency too.
Well, efficiency is really the key. You have to be able to get air into motion. And we get a very realistic sound in the bass, and I feel that we have broken the major barrier to electronic organ bass, for example, where ordinarily the bass in electronic organ is mushy and percussive and indefinite as far as pitch goes, especially in low bass notes. When our speakers are used with electronic organ, the bass notes are true to pitch. The electronic organ then becomes useful with a full complement of orchestral instruments or choral arrangements and so on. Notoriously, they have been left out of standard or authentic musical renditions because of their inability to get that accurate pitch in the low bass notes. Now, for stereo, that tapered opening has rather beneficial effect in that it automatically disperses the highs in an extremely uniform manner. The net result is that you're able to sit just about anywhere in front of those speakers and get the full stereo effect. And this is one of the major deterrents to the acceptance of stereo. Frequently it's been lampooned on TV and magazines and other places that people have been required to sit in some very, very exact spot in front of speakers. In fact, I've actually experienced a case where if I moved my head about 1 inch, I went in and out of the stereo image.
That's right.
Well, with our units, you can walk about anywhere in the room and still get this stereo effect because of this dispersion.
Well, I know of one particular test for stereo effect that I have stumbled upon inadvertently is by standing along the same wall as the speakers are on. And if you can get some separation, you've got pretty good stereo effect.
I always demonstrate that way.
Because at home where I use my speaker systems, the chair that I favor is along the same wall as the speaker. So when I look down the room, all I see are the sides of the enclosures. And I can still get almost perfect stereo separation, and they're facing away from me.
This is necessary, especially for people who are accustomed or who never seem to be able to get decent center seats at the Met. I have seats this Wednesday, obstructed view all the way on the side. Reminds me of my speaker systems and my big easy chair.
Well, I think there are several viewpoints on this separation and so on. I feel that a stereo speaker system should recreate the entire sound image. In other words, if you're listening to an orchestra, it shouldn't be left and right. It should be a full expansive sound with the complete panorama of sound across the entire sound stage. And this is what we're able to create.
I'd like to ask you one question pertaining to that. Assuming you have two loudspeakers, anybody's loudspeakers, doesn't matter, and you have them set up 7, 8, 10 feet apart. As you walk up to the front plane of the speakers, if they're properly balanced and the angle of dispersion is proper, you should feel like you're walking right into the middle of the orchestra.
That's right.
As you walk past the front plane, should you feel as if you've just left a thin wall of orchestra, or should you feel that you're right dead center in the middle with instruments to the front, back, left, and right?
You're going to need a phenomenal dispersion pattern. I deliberately set my X5 speakers about 12 feet apart, and the sitting area is about 4 feet away. You get a wall of sound because of the dispersion factor.
Yes,
I
but
agree
does
with
this
you
wall have any depth to it, or is it just a thin wall
It is not
that
a
you
thin
can
wall.
pass through like a
That
doorway?
depends upon the dispersion pattern. Stereophile reviewed my smaller shelf speakers, and they only tested it for a 45-degree radiating angle, which they said was extremely uniform, so that it definitely placed your instruments where they were supposed to be without any wandering of the instruments. This will happen if you have a wide dispersion pattern which does not vary in intensity from one point to another. You shouldn't nod off to sleep and suddenly lose the cymbals as you tilt your head.
Well, there are the speakers, and I'm sure you've come across this. Excuse me for one moment.
The
John.
center channel, of course, is most desirable for the depth effect.
Well,
That's what I've been told, but I still
Yeah.
managed to get a
Well,
very fine stereo spread.
We don't use the center channel at all.
I've been told this, but I get this fine wall of stereo, and you can walk up virtually almost 180 degrees.
past the front of the speakers.
Yes, and still feel sound in front of you as well as to both sides.
Well, the point I'm trying to bring out, as you pass the front plane of the speakers and walk, let us say, behind them.
As you do that, you step on my citation too.
Is that, well... Have you come across the phenomenon of where you're sitting and listening to a particular speaker system, and I'm sure your speakers aren't guilty of this.
Thank you.
Where someone walks between you and the speakers and all the highs drop out, like a curtain was put in?
That's if he carries a curtain as he's walking.
No, there are speakers which have a top end which are very directional, and it sounds as if the top 10 kc is just, as they pass.
With a very directional, where it beams your highs. I have a very fine dispersion of highs, a very even dispersion. It doesn't happen then.
There is some slight loss, but not this direct drop.
We get 120 degrees with our units, and I've never noticed.
That's pretty hot.
Well, there's an old trick that was mentioned in one of the audio magazines. If you have a speaker system with a directional high, a directional high end, and you want to disperse your highs a little more, is to glue a ping pong ball up in front of it. And this ping pong ball acts as a baffle for the sound to come around. And
but then you get cavity resonances.
Well, you're supposed to fill the ping pong ball with cream cheese or something like that.
I prefer whipped cream. It gives you a sweeter sound.
Magic bag ping pong ball. I think every device imaginable has been tried to get wire dispersion. The most successful, I know, that in competition with ours is the acoustic lens. That gets about 90 degrees with good uniform dispersion, depending upon its size. If it's smaller, you can get a little more.
Well, I invite people to walk 180 degrees off axis. They don't lose the highs. You just begin to get a slight variation and fall off. And this is a dead room.
Well, I'm not talking, within about 4 dB. I'm not saying 10, 15.
There are many ways of achieving this.
Are you gentlemen ready to field a couple of questions on loudspeakers?
Right.
Okay. Irving Freed from Philadelphia. I think we all know Mr. Freed.
Yeah, the name rings a bell.
IMF, if I'm not mistaken. Please define the word transient. What about 12 5-inch speakers on one board? Many years ago, a magazine said that this was the greatest.
So, I think that 5 12-inch speakers on a 1-inch board are much better than 12 5-inch speakers. No, seriously, Irv. This is Irving Freed?
Irving Freed. Right. I don't know if this is the same gentleman, but it's a possibility.
Yeah, the name rings a bell. I've heard a great deal of nice things about him. Transient response is the ability of your loudspeaker cone to recover instead of to move extraneously when it receives a signal. Now, one of the big problems in transient response is this, that this armature or moving cone has to flop in order to have a low resonance to reproduce the bass. Then you have to start loading it to prevent it from moving over too great an excursion. It can't possibly, when it flops, it can't have sufficient velocity to get back in time. Therefore, it gobbles up all the information in the bass. You cannot get your definition, the separation of instruments. Piano is a very good example. When you switch from a speaker with good transients to one of bad transients, it's immediately apparent that one speaker is very definitive. The recovery is instantaneous. Now, air molecules are not flopping back and forth over great distances. The number of cycles per second is your bass. The depth of excursion is your amplitude, but even then it should be virtually microscopic. I visited Joe Grado a little while ago and saw a new speaker he's coming out with for about $150.
This is not the Grado Jr., is it?
No, it's a new big one. It's not on the market yet. I didn't see that cone move. And then he has some distributed tube arrangement around it. Joe, I hate to say this, but although I was very much impressed, I do get certain things with this tubular arrangement, which I tried some time ago. But it was impressive to me that he's got phenomenal loading. That cone doesn't move, but it reproduces bass. It doesn't appear to move. And he's on the right track. Now, my cones, again, do not appear to move. although they'll give you over 1.5 inch excursion. The cones appear almost to stand still unless you have oscillations and or if you set the tone arm down, you get about 1 inch or over 1.25 inches, up to 1.5 inch excursion. But at the heaviest pedal notes of an organ, bass drums, etc., the cone barely seems to tremble. And yet you get great energy as a result of this. The signal, instead of going into a speaker and moving large amounts of air, which have nothing to do with the audible sound. If I want to move large amounts of air, I buy an electric fan. And most speakers act like an electric fan. It moves air that you don't hear. It wastes the information, the signal, the information in the signal.
I'm inclined to disagree with you there.
I'm not speaking about the coupling, once you've coupled it.
Well, we couple a speaker to the air so that very little motion is required in order to get the energy necessary to create the sound.
Right. Your speaker cones do not flop back and forth, do they? They're well loaded. That's my point.
Absolutely. Even with the heaviest organ tones, it's a rare instance where they might move 1/8 of an inch.
But it barely seems to tremble, isn't that right?
We can reproduce 16 cycles with 1/8 of an inch motion.
Right. That's the way it should be.
Now, we don't depend on bass resonance for our sound.
But I disagree with one bit of design. Although I respect your enclosure, I've always been very much impressed with it. I still feel direct radiation is the answer, where you reproduce sound. Otherwise, you're forced to produce the bass instead of reproducing it. But there is a difference.
Well, I don't agree with you at all.
Talking about that,
I still like it.
If we can get on, Mr. Pantel in Great Neck has a question which he directs towards Reuben Guss. He would be interested to see if Argus could equal the electro voice patrician on heavy orchestral pieces.
I'm coming out with a custom speaker which will net for $600. I'll be demonstrating it in about 10 days to 2 weeks. Can I give the address?
Why not?
315 West End Avenue. It's the corner of 75th Street. Music and Art Gallery. This, I believe, will do a more successful job. Even now, my X5B, which we net for $225, I feel gives you greater authenticity with full orchestra than this big patrician electro voice. My custom speakers decidedly give you finer transient response and a bigger dispersion factor. I give the patrician this. It does have this big open sound. My custom speakers, I think, will have a far more open sound. They contain a 15-inch, 12, 2/8, 4 super tweeters, and with a new principle, which effectively appears to give you almost the effect of 200 cubic feet of air, because there's a speaker which internally moves air in the cabinet in sympathy with the direct radiators, but at a slightly different amplitude to give you a measure of damping to the speaker. Also the suspension principle, which is segmented, very heavily damped, very tough. The moving parts won't wear nearly as readily as other cones. With this speaker, I expect to demonstrate. If he's willing to drag a big patrician electro voice to my place, we'll set it side by side.
How big will this new speaker system be?
Not so big. It'll be about 23.5 inches wide, 15.5 inches deep, and about 32 inches high on a 3 or 4 inch pedestal.
Well, now talking
That's
about
the size of our enclosure. We've had actual A/B tests with the patrician, and
I am not impressed with the patrician.
And people have gone
well, there
out
again,
and said,
speakers are personal preference.
Yeah.
No, it shouldn't be a personal preference. To a degree, once you've purchased it, of course, it's a personal preference. But when you design it, fidelity means faithfulness to the original, and how authentically does it reproduce the instruments, and how successfully does it delineate the instruments of the orchestra. I can demonstrate, if he'll bring his patrician down, I don't want to carry it. I'll put one alongside of the other, and I'll demonstrate that the Argus, even the smaller model, the 225, will separate your instruments more successfully and with more authenticity.
Well, talking about the Argus and the Karlson speakers, Ernest Larson in Brooklyn would like to have you gentlemen discuss the prices of your particular speaker systems. John, why don't you start?
Well, our line of speakers range anywhere from $29.50 up to $339.
Can you give us a sort of rough breakdown on the model and comparative price?
Well, the 2950 is our new ceiling speakers, which can be built into a home, and several have been built in very fine homes where the people want music throughout the entire home. And they may use
this is
many
very
10
non-committal type music, it's background type music
It's
installation.
nice background music.
Yeah.
Then,
Speakers in the ceiling should be good for reproducing highs.
Reuben,
I'm sorry, John, I apologize.
Reuben,
but these again are so designed that they project the sound forward in a broad fan-type beam, so that you can sit or stand anywhere. You can arrange your furniture in any way, and you still get the stereo effect.
You don't have to lie on the floor to enjoy it.
No, not at all.
what else in the line?
Then as you go up, we have the 12-inch speakers.
This is with an enclosure? Or this
Our primary business is an enclosure. People usually buy a coaxial speaker and mount them in our enclosures, and we sell these all over the world. And they find that after comparison with all types of enclosure techniques, that ours generally outperform anything else that they can buy. And it gives them a very, very fine sound at a very moderate cost. And say our 15-inch enclosures, which sell in a kit form from $44.95 to $69.50, they can be assembled by the novice carpenter or cabinet maker very readily. They can put a good speaker in there, or even an inexpensive speaker, and he'll get sound that extremely difficult to reproduce with anything near the price. For example, we had an inexpensive speaker in one of our enclosures when we introduced our unit, and we had an A/B test with a patrician, and the difference was so fantastic that people who are professionals in the field went out of the room saying, "Oh my God, I just didn't believe that we could do what we actually did." And of course, our top level speakers use an extremely fine coaxial type speaker, and they're in walnut enclosures. They sell for $339.
Well, Reuben, your speakers are entirely different. When you buy an Argus-X, you get the entire enclosure and speakers.
That's right.
All
As
of
a
the
system.
bookshelves are sold today as a system.
Yeah, well, we sell complete systems too. But I mean,
Well, what do your speakers run in price and model
We're
numbers?
reintroducing the X1s.
Yeah.
They will net for $100
These are only available at music and art galleries?
at the moment, yes, at 315 West End Avenue. We used to have them in about 8 shops, and we only gave them 1/3 fair trading the speakers. And they're mostly order takers. They want to see you advertise a great deal. For a while, they did a splendid job. When they A-B'd, they sold our speakers. But then they found it was much easier. They got much better inducements, up to 50% off, for example, on EMIs, which they could fair trade. So they stopped selling the speaker. People ask, "Can we hear this?" "Oh, you wouldn't be interested," they were told. So I stopped teaching full-time, and I began doing this full-time. I teach now in the evenings. I'm willing to spend as much time as you'd like demonstrating and comparing them to top-name speakers at 315 West End Avenue. We may go back into the shops in the fall. So we have this speaker that nets for $100. We'll be selling them for $75 in the future. Right now, we'll sell them for $65, introductory price. It's the X1. We'll put them alongside an AR2A and have fun.
What comes after the X1?
The X3B with 2 super tweeters, 2 full-range coax units. This X3B will put against any $300 and $400 system.
This is also in the standard bookshelf size, 2 by
Bookshelf
1
size.
by 1, or roughly
25 inches by 14 wide by 11 deep.
2 by 1 by 1.
Then there's the X5B, which nets for $300. It has 5 speakers, 2 super tweeters, and 3 full-range Argus-X speakers, dual con. and these sell net for $300 and sell for $225 as an introductory price. The custom speakers will be demonstrating in 10 days to 2 weeks. These custom speakers are for people who own Marantz, Citation, or any of the top equipment. I'm sure they're not getting what they ought to get. When they hear this speaker, A beat, and again we invite you to bring any speaker in against any of our speakers. But the custom speaker should be unique. Might even sound as good as a Karlson.
Well,
John?
to give equal mention, KRC, Karlson, is at 24 Church Street in Malvern, Long Island, and you can reach them. May they call you there?
Yes.
At 516, which is the Nassau area code, and IV93641. And our phone number is here at WNCN 104.3 in New York, Plaza 20870. We have one line open at the moment.
Well, I have a request here for my phone number.
Oh, wonderful.
I just requested it. SU7-4362. That's Susquehanna 7-4362.
And in South Africa?
2 to 7 p.m.
Oh, why not? Esther Kurtz on Putnam Avenue in Ridgewood would like to have an opinion of the Traveler tape recorder. Is that the one that's sold by Sears?
Well, I haven't used it, so I wouldn't be competent to.
I haven't the remotest idea.
No. She'd also like to know, is there any variation in the width of recording tape? Yes, there is. 90% of the recording tape sold today is the standard 1/4-inch wide tape. There is tape available 1/2 inch and 1 inch wide for professional applications. But as I said, perhaps 99% of your tape sold today is all 1/4 inch wide. And it shouldn't vary within the reel or from reel to reel. It should all be a 1/4 inch wide. Walter Kimmel in the Bronx has 4 KLH6s, 2 on each channel. We'd like to know the relative merits of 2 per channel to 1 per channel.
A little more bass.
How do you feel about 2 speakers per channel, Reuben?
I don't think that you get twice as much sound. I think you get a point of diminishing returns.
Like anything
But
else.
it's a little bit better in any speaker if you have more of them. Then you have the problem, of course, of impedance matching.
Well,
which you have
this
to
we
look at.
assume has been done properly
I
and
imagine
phasing.
dispersion would be a problem with that
Yeah.
arrangement.
Yeah. Sid Smith in Paramus, New Jersey, mentioned that at the recent Hi-Fi show he heard an 18-inch Hartley speaker, and they were playing, speaking of Hartley, Bob Schmetera of Hartley was supposed to be here tonight, but he couldn't make it. They were playing the King of Instruments records. On the recording, the commentator stated it started at 16 cycles and went up, and he had just heard 2 gentlemen on this show saying that speakers don't reproduce that low, so he wants to know what he was hearing at the show.
The 2 gentlemen here never said that.
No, no, our speakers will absolutely reproduce 16 cycles. If it's on a recording, if it comes out of the amplifier, we will reproduce it.
You'll need a large room, though, in order to get the effect.
Quite
the proper wavelength.
definitely.
In fact,
You must.
our units have been tested down below 8 cycles.
I'd be happy to put a signal generator in my units and let them listen. And the pitch is so accurate, you'll hear the difference from one cycle to another, from 30 up. We'll go down to 20 on any of our speakers, and you'll just about hear 20 cycles. You'll feel most of it.
We've actually shaken buildings. In Los Angeles, we were testing the unit, and we wanted to have a minimum feedback between the turntable and the speaker. And chap was holding the turntable in his hand at the time. We managed to boost bass. Well, we struck the resonant frequency of the hotel. It was about 8 cycles. It actually shook. The people down in the lobby thought it was an earth tremor. And the chap that was in the room at the time ran out. He thought the ceiling was going down.
Well, it either means you've got a great speaker or they got lousy hotels.
Well, I'm thinking you ought to introduce a seismograph with your speakers.
Mr. Eggman in New York City would like an evaluation of the EJ Corvette XAM 3D speaker.
John?
I don't know the first thing about it.
I have
heard-
been told that they are using the Goodman speakers in there.
No, the
Truly-
C's.
Who?
Is this Corvettes?
Yes.
They're using the C's speakers, I think.
I think.
I think.
There again, nobody has any definitive information on it.
Let me think a moment. Yes, I'm pretty sure they're using the C's speakers.
That is Reuben Guss of Argus-X stating an opinion.
It's an opinion. That's right. It's
Robert,
not a bad sound. It's a live sound, but again, when you're looking for full range and full authenticity, within the limits of that price, it's not a bad speaker.
Robert Schwend on Topping Avenue in the Bronx would like to have us get off speakers for a moment and find out what is the difference between crystal ceramic and magnetic stereo cartridges, and can a crystal cartridge be used with an amplifier that has inputs for a ceramic cartridge? To answer the last part first, yes. They're both high output cartridges. High output meaning pretty close to a volt output. The difference between the two, basically, well, right off the bat, is that a magnetic stereo cartridge gives you a relatively low output on the order of about 5 to 7 millivolts per channel. I think that the Orthophon gives you the highest output of about 13 millivolts per channel. They have built-in transformers. I should know the rest of the difference between them. I think that, well, for instance, a crystal or ceramic cartridge is virtually insensitive to hum of any sort, since they use a generating element, a piezoelectric element, whereas a magnetic stereo cartridge is susceptible to a certain amount of hum, depending upon how well it is shielded. I think your most popular cartridges today are all magnetics. There are probably many more advantages to magnetic cartridges over crystals than I can remember accurately.
Do they sound better?
There are those people who are manufacturing crystal cartridges today who say they sound as good. Your best cartridges today, of course, are your magnetics. I think they have a wider dynamic range and a sweeter sound than your crystal. You'll find in your packaged consoles that they all use a ceramic or crystal type cartridge because you really don't need a preamplifier with them. You can drive a power amplifier and it saves wear and tear, and they're comparatively inexpensive. You can buy a ceramic or crystal cartridge today from about $2 on up for your little portable phonographs. But your better cartridges, your top line of cartridges today, well, let's put it this way, no hi-fi bug worth his salt would be caught using a salt type cartridge.
Okay.
Oh, well, that's as bad as your highs on the ceiling.
Really reaching out.
Well, he's had his revenge.
Yeah.
I had a
A
comment.
fast question before we go out for the news with Tom Karlson. From Tom Olson in New York. Is the Hartley Luth speaker, which is an 18-inch woofer with a response down to 16 cycles, the best woofer made? Well, gentlemen?
That could be subject of quite a discussion there.
Well, do you feel that the
I'm
larger the
reluctant to
woofer...
discuss this without
Right.
the presence of Mr. Schmetter.
No.
Well,
But I do not agree that the size of the woofer necessarily makes it the best woofer. You've got your 30-inch
Electro Voice.
voice.
You have a large speaker, which would presumably give you better bass as a direct radiator. But the bass you get is dependent not only on the speaker alone, but the combination of the speaker and the enclosure.
Also, the design is an important factor. If that speaker is wasting the signal and moving air that has nothing to do with sound, you're not going to get that much clean bass.
It's just passing through the air.
It's transients. Otherwise, you have virtually a fan. It's moving air that'll cool you off in the summertime.
Yeah.
But I'm not saying this is true of the... no, he has a good magnetic suspension. It's not a bad speaker. I've heard it. I was impressed.
Well, we're just about over with the first hour. There's Tom Karlson rushing like a madman to sit down at the board.
Karlson, that name rings a bell.
Yeah, no relation. This is the Hi-Fi Workbench on WNCN-FM 104.3 in New York. Our lines are busy right now, but keep trying. Plaza 2 0870, and we'll be back in about 5 or 6 minutes with the second half.
The speaker systems in the industry for the benefit of the AR group.
Well, then why, in effect, don't you say that the people at Consumers Union don't know what they're talking about?
I'm saying that exactly.
Well, this, again, is a personal opinion.
No, it's not a personal opinion. The Consumers Union made certain statements, say, in our field. I'll stick to my field for the moment. Enclosures. They said that an enclosure cannot influence the quality of sound. Now, every engineer in the business knows that this is untrue. And they made several other statements relative to enclosures. Now, we were outselling Vilcher at that time by a considerable margin. The publicity that accrued through this Consumers Union article resulted in a loss of business to us. So, by virtue of this publicity, which was definitely incorrect, I could take 20 or 30 different statements in that article which are completely unscientific and were not according to engineering principles. Could be torn apart. In fact, Audio Engineering magazine stated that whoever wrote that article was probably sampling the liquors that were also rated in that same magazine. I mean, this is the degree of acceptance that the professionals in the industry gave to that particular article. Yet, that article succeeded in selling $1 million worth of speakers.
Naturally. How many people read the Audio Engineering Society magazine?
Right. So, therefore, this, let's get to the point. This again, is a media of transmitting information to the many people.
Well, may I just ask one point here? Did they rate this AR loudspeaker as a Best Buy or as the best thing around?
Well, they gave the impression it was the best, regardless. But some of the coy expressions in there said it was within a certain price category and so on. Now, we in turn conducted tests following this rating of the Consumers Union. We tested the best speakers available then on the market. We took 100 knowledgeable people, musicians, engineers, and so on. And we took these various systems and we had these tests conducted. And it was not a matter of a 5 or 10 minute test. Each one of these people had an opportunity of 1 or 2 hours, as long as they wanted to listen, to make a comparison as what would be the best. At the conclusion of that test, it's found that 85% of the people voted for our units. The next one down was the Klipschorn, then the Bozak, and so on. The AR didn't even rate. Now, if the AR had been that superior, it would have been somewhere higher in that rating. Similar tests were conducted by the Hi-Fi Trade News, where they conducted tests including the speaker that was graded as unacceptable. The unacceptable speaker was rated superior in 3 separate categories out of 6, superior to other speakers in 3 separate categories. The AR was rated superior in only 1, and this was in a test behind a screen, so the people could not be influenced by the appearance of the unit. So this said there was no validation in subsequent testing or testing under truly objective conditions which would give authenticity to this rating, which resulted in so many sales and resulted in making a fantastic business. Now, It was all a result of the fact that these articles downgraded the rest of the industry. I believe that the rest of the industry should have an opportunity to fight back. I'm willing to accept any challenge of any party who will want to argue the relative merits of, say, a low efficiency unit against ours.
And also, you did say, go ahead, Reuben, mention names. Now, I don't want to lay the blame at your
No,
so.
no, I did, but as I said, I think there's a point between propriety and, just...
Well, if we provide information, sometimes you're forced to mention names.
Yeah, mentioning names is fine, but I think there becomes a point where you overstep the boundaries of decorum.
Yeah, I did it with a sense of honesty. This was a matter of...
This is true. This was not done with any...
ethically, ethical, because I felt that I was expressing my feeling, my belief. And I felt this belief was predicated upon a test that I could run. And if they're willing to accept the challenge, by all means, come, visit, bring your ARs with you. Of course, I've had some people who would say this. I'd play the AR, it would sound quite pleasant. And I'd switch to an Argus, and they'd say, oh, there's something wrong with the AR, you've doctored it. Then they'd bring their own AR down and discover that nothing was doctored. So run the test at your leisure. Set up the conditions yourself. But still, I must mention names, and I felt that I had the freedom here.
You do, as anyone does when, at least I'm
to speak
running the show.
Freely. These
to
are
speak
my
freely.
sentiments. These are the results of the tests I've had. You can validate this for yourself. I'm inviting you to.
Talking about loudspeakers, Brian Roberts in Brooklyn would like to know very quickly, 2 8-ohm speaker systems wired in parallel or series, which requires a change in wiring?
I don't quite understand the question.
Well, if you have
to wire 2 8-ohms in series, you have to use your 16-ohm tap on your amplifier.
That's what he means.
In parallel, 2 in parallel, 4 ohms.
It's 4 ohms, so they both require a wiring change off the 8-ohm.
Right.
In parallel, it is
4 ohms.
4 ohms. In series, 16 ohms.
Right, and make sure that they
both are
phase
ground. Yes. Okay, I think that answers another question that I saw in here. Mr. Polk in Jersey City, associated equipment is a Dyna PAS-2 preamp and a Stereo 70, AR turntable, Shure M7D cartridge. A loaded question here. Best Buy and bookshelf type speaker systems, dollar for dollar.
If I answer this, there'll be another phone call, I'm afraid.
Dollar for dollar.
One of our standard claims.
That's one of mine, too.
A Best Buy, that's hard to say. I think there becomes a point of diminishing returns, where you're spending more from for the loudspeaker than a comparable unit will give you for $50 less.
Well, I'd like to comment just a little on that. Logically, more money ought to go into the loudspeaker.
Yes.
If you're going to make a sacrifice, if you have a limited budget, put it into the loudspeaker, because the biggest differences show up among loudspeakers. Smaller differences show up among other components.
We still haven't answered this question.
Exist.
I'll disagree 180 degrees out of phase of what you just said. I started my business on the basis of the fact that I took a $3.50 speaker, put it in one of our enclosures, and compared
Made it sound just like an Argus-X.
No, I compared it with what was then a standard speaker in the industry. It was a high-priced Jensen in a regular bass reflex. That $3.50 speaker, believe it or not, outperformed this expensive Jensen. So this is a direct contradiction to what you just said.
No, not all. Well, it may be a... No, not really.
In our enclosure, it really
I think what the
difference.
problem is that the public, when you make a statement like that, you took a $3.50 speaker that was made, Bent Elbow, Idaho someplace, against the Jensen speaker, which probably sold for $150 or something like that. Say, well, look at this fantastic difference. How can it possibly sound as good or better or even close to it? They associate price with quality, which is a good unit of measurement
but
to
I
a
want
point.
to point out the importance of the enclosure because the speaker itself is very, very limited. It's natural. It should have a good magnet, should have good cone structure and so on, these different things. But with an enclosure, you can make a fantastic difference. And
Well, I was
this-
speaking as a generalization. Given the speaker field as it now exists, the biggest differences among the components are with the speakers. And the money, I feel, logically ought to go towards speakers. If you will, it includes
No,
enclosures when I
we
discuss
take it in
speakers.
entirely different categories.
But then
When you use
when you
our
mention-
enclosure,
Yeah. When you
We're
mentioned
talking about
something they
different
said in this Consumers Union article about the enclosure not being important, I thought in my mind about the strings of a violin, and it doesn't matter whether you have a Stradivarius case or not.
Well, talking about enclosures, Robert Rothschild on West End Avenue plans to use a tannoy 12-inch dual concentric speaker in an 8 cubic foot infinite baffle with a height of 41 inches, depth of 15.5, and a 24-inch internal width. Would you gentlemen consider the height to depth ratio too great? And he plans to use 2 inches of Toughflex insulation all around. This is a Barbajai special if I ever heard one. What do you think of a 12-inch tannoy in an enclosure of those dimensions? 41 by 15.5 by 2 foot.
41 by 15.
It's a very curious thing when you fool with speakers and enclosures. The only way you can answer that is pragmatically. My guess, an educated guess, is that it'll get a very lovely sound. It's a fine speaker. And he's got plenty of cubic space, cubic air, space in that cabinet, so that he ought to get a very fine sound.
Fine.
You get a nice.
Harold Anapole in the Bronx. A question for Mr. Guss. What is your opinion between your most expensive speaker system and the AR3?
Well, I think we've already answered this. The most expensive speaker we have?
Yes,
I
right
would
now.
not compare two smaller units. It's an unfair comparison. You compare the most expensive units to other most expensive units. Right now, I would compare my own shelf unit to the AR3 and let you make the
Well, where do you
distinction.
feel
I think when
your
you listen-
speaker is superior or the AR3 is deficient? Very quickly.
Very quickly?
Yes.
As you listen to the information in the bass, do you get the information or do instruments drop out? When you listen to mid-range, the AR I feel is weak in mid-range. The top end, the transients again in my speaker are far superior. And again, this is something I demonstrate with records. You have to listen to whether or not the information appears with authenticity or not. The best test instrument I know for this is the human ear.
Mr. Freed from Philadelphia called back. He said the experts didn't answer his question about the 12 small loudspeakers on one large board. Please do so.
I can only speak from theory, and again, an educated guess. But it achieves one thing.
It moves a lot of air.
It moves a lot of air, and it with less excursion of the diaphragm, so that they do achieve something with this. It's not a bad sound, theoretically. It would be an acceptable sound. You can move a lot of air, and you'll get a response which far exceeds what you would normally expect from a 5-inch cone. And one reason is you've improved the transients. By distributing the job among so many speakers, you're able to move a lot of air without excessive excursion.
And theoretically, 1,000 of these should sound even better.
I'm not sure of
Your
that.
directivity would be fantastic.
Yeah. Also, what do you think of polystyrene and loudspeakers? He's heard that they are the best.
I have an opinion.
Go
Have
ahead.
you, John?
John?
Well, that's the Hartley speaker you're speaking of.
Well, I've been
Pretty much.
listening, and I think it depends upon the basic design of the speaker. You can get a good styrene sound. I've been disappointed in the styrene sounds. I felt that their major advantage was that they wouldn't flex. You see, when you have a deep excursion, you get flexure of the cone. And the styrene resisted this. I still feel paper gives you a more natural sound. And if the excursion can be kept way down, where you eliminate this flexure and distortion, I feel it is a more natural sound.
Well, I tested the Hartley speaker in one of our enclosures. I found the sound to be exceptionally good, very, very clean. But then this is would not be a typical sound, say, in the baffle, because we have extremely little cone motion of any speaker in our enclosure. So with the speaker acting essentially as a piston, and with the large magnet he had on there, it drove very well, and excellent, very clean sound.
It's a nice sounding speaker. It's a neutral sound.
It's a very clean. It's quite bright.
Can we digress for one moment? A gentleman called in, Mr. Friedman. I'm sorry I passed up his question. He wants to connect two speakers to one amplifier. They're both 4 ohms in parallel. How does he wire them up?
Well, the closest match you can get is to connect it to the 4 ohm tap. He won't have a serious mismatch.
All right.
It's a 2 ohm impedance, but it won't hurt.
It's the sum of one speaker divided by the number of speakers.
Well, there is a formula for it.
Well, roughly, that's about what it works out to. All right, that's that and that. And
When you get different impedances, you have a much different formula. But
yeah,
granted, the impedance is the same. That
two
formula
4 ohm
applies.
speakers.
Right.
Mr. Phillips, who says this is the 3rd week he's called in without an answer. At 1120 Park, he has bought 2 new Leak speakers. Have you heard, and what do you think?
I like them. I think they're a nice neutral sound. I don't think they make a very big impression. They're not a dramatic sound, but it's a nice natural sound. I think they're a fine speaker.
He also says that most speakers rated at 16 ohms, he plays at 8 ohms. What do you think of that?
The mismatch is not serious enough. If you play something that's an 8 ohm speaker, for example, at 16 ohms, you may appear to get more amplitude. And again, it's not too serious a mismatch. With some speakers, the mismatch may be more critical. On the average speaker, it is not quite that critical between 8 and 16.
All right, let's see if we can take care of some of these questions that have been lying here for a while. Mike Rosenfeld in New York would like to know why, when any soft music is played on his hi-fi system, he has a Lafayette KT250 amplifier and 508 tuner, and when volume is turned up about halfway, a sort of scratchy sound is present in one of the speakers, and the same thing happens when he switches channels into the other speaker, and when he uses his turntables. Is that when he uses his turntable only? Why, and what can he do?
Well, Lafayette is very good about servicing their equipment.
Well, what does it sound like to you?
It sounds to me, well, if he would manually take the speaker that seems to be offending and put it on the other side, switch sides, and discovers that it follows the speaker, the fault is with the speaker. But if it stays on the same channel, the scratchy sound, then he ought to have his amplifier checked.
Well, he says he switches using channel reverse.
And then it goes to the other side. It's probably
Right.
within the amplifier.
Probably something in the tone circuitry. I wouldn't.
And Lafayette would correct us.
I wish Marty were here, to a degree. Jack Waxman in the Bronx would like an opinion of the RCA LC1A speakers.
Very good.
It's a very curious speaker. This thing can be a great loudspeaker, properly enclosed, or it can shriek and blow the top of your head off, depending on how you enclose it. I think the design is brilliant. It's a beautiful speaker.
What is this? Is this a speaker itself? Is this
It's
a complete
15-inch
system?
speaker, and it
15-inch
has
speaker.
nipples on it for mid-range dispersion. The tweeter could be tamed a little, depending again upon the enclosure. But it's a very well-designed speaker.
A lot
Very
of
well
thought
designed.
and effort has gone.
Olson
Yeah.
designed it.
Yes, it's very good.
Beautiful piece of work.
Mo Clint in Patterson, New Jersey, has a Fisher 800C receiver. His cabinet enclosure is 22 by 17 by 17 and can't get standard speakers inside. Oh, I see, it's about speakers. He wants to install 2 speakers of the finest quality in the enclosure, which is 2 3/4 cubic foot. Which can he put in there? He likes the Jensen 600. Is that a 15-inch speaker? 12-inch?
Yeah, 15-inch.
I'm not sure. If it's in the same cabinet that contains the equipment, he may have a feedback problem with his phonograph.
Yeah,
So,
that's a
Well, most of
pretty
your,
small enclosure.
yeah, well, this is about standard size of most of these things that you buy at these shops that advertise, you know, this
My
big,
advice
the
is to get a
9-foot
system.
monster.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there becomes a point where, for one reason or another, a wife doesn't like, you know, components around. She wants
Yeah.
a thing with a bar and a television set. Looks great, sounds terrible. You know, one of those kind of things.
Yeah.
I think 2 speakers, or at least one 12-inch that doesn't require a great deal of volume to give you a low frequency response. It requires a little investigation, a little trying around, asking questions.
Let him
You
listen
have
to
to-
the big speakers and
He
small
might
players.
he might write to the New York Audio Society at Post Office Box 2686, New York 1, New York. They'll answer this.
Yeah, well, he should select, for that small volume, select the speaker that having the greatest compliance possible. Look at the resonant frequency of the speaker. Try to get one that would resonate about 25 cycles.
The Jensen Flex Airs have a low
Jensen
resonance.
Flex Air would fall in that category.
Yeah. William Marston in Forest Hills would like to know what kind of formula is required to fuse a loudspeaker. There was, if I may, one comment, in Larry Klein's column in Hi-Fi Stereo Review, either the March or the February issue, they went into this fusing of loudspeakers and what the formula was and everything like that. It's this month, I'm pretty sure it was the February issue, but if you gentlemen have any information you'd like to pass on.
Well, there's a simple wattage formula of I square R. Take the wattage rating of the speaker and the resistance or the impedance of that speaker, the watts equal I square R. This will give you, well, R is the impedance of the speaker. This will give you the current, the maximum current that this speaker can tolerate. Now, if you cut this figure by 1/2 to add a safety factor, you can arrive at some fuse value for the speaker. It's also well to have a resistor of, say, about 30 ohms or so across the fuse, so that when the fuse does blow, if it does, that you will not have an open-ended amplifier.
You don't want to burn your transformer. So this is good advice. But it should be a high wattage resistor, remember. At least 20
I said 30 ohms,
30
so that
ohms.
the wattage need not be so great. 10 watts would be more than adequate.
Really? I usually play it safe with 20. Plus I'm using 120 watt safe.
But you should always have a load across your amplifier, otherwise you're going to get a problem. Particularly if you have a transistor.
It's good advice.
All right, and we have some questions on tape recorders and some other equipment. Then we have a whole bunch of questions here aimed directly at Reuben Guss and his statements, which we'll get to. We'll see if we can take care of some of these and then go back to the Reuben Guss controversy. Charles McDermott in Brooklyn would like to know how many hours should playback and record head in an Ampex 44, I guess, and Tandberg 64 last, assuming proper care.
I'm not knowledgeable in this area, John.
Well, they should. Oh, go ahead, John. Do you have something?
Well, I have a Tandberg, and it's lasted me a couple of years without any.
If you take
Great
proper
wear.
care of it, the only thing that the Tandberg has, opposed to the Ampex, is that in the fast-forward positions, the Tandberg has a tape lifter, whereas the Ampex doesn't. Now, all of your tapes today, your brand name tapes, are lubricated tapes, and they, to a degree, prevent head wear. But like anything else, you have, where you have friction, you generate some wear. Tape, as you know, is iron oxide, very fine, on a acetate base, and this is like basically extremely fine sandpaper, and continual fast motion of tape across the heads will create somewhere and widen the gap width in the playback head, causing an extreme high frequency emphasis and a low frequency roll-off. You can check this by looking at the head. If you can see a black vertical line down the center of the head, you've got some head wear, and you should be noticing some high frequency emphasis. They should last quite a while. I don't know, 1,000 hours with proper care, 2,000 hours.
Sounds like a good thing.
Well, I have a Tandberg.
Call Ingolf Nielsen at Tandberg. He'll tell you. I don't know. I know someone who's got them in has Tandberg heads in a crown deck and uses it for playback only at 15 inches a second, and he's had them in there for 3 or 4 years, and he zonks this tape through. It's not standing still. With proper care, they should last quite a while. They're excellent heads, by the way. Tandberg. Jack Smith in New York would like to know, how does a 15-inch Tannoy speaker in a Belvedere senior enclosure compare with a Patrician?
I like it better. It may not sound as impressive, but I think it's more natural.
It has a very clean sound.
Anything else?
The Patrician is capable of moving more air. It's a bigger,
Seems like a bigger sound.
bigger open sound.
A motion picture recording engineer would like to know why the Altec Lansing 605A in some enclosure is used in so many studios and recording studios.
Yes,
So
why?
Why? I don't know. I once had a theory. I was speaking to Marty about that once, and I think that what happened, the first studio conned the pair from Altec Lansing, and everybody else said, well, they've got this, and we've got to have this also. I think I spoke to a musician once and asked him why, and he said, well, he plays the trumpet and makes the trumpet sound so bright, and so all that punch in the mid-range, that they like this. It has a bright sound. There's no getting away from it. The 605 has a bright
605 is a
sound.
good speaker, and quite a few studios are beginning to use our units, our enclosures, 605 in our enclosure for that very purpose.
Mr. Sandak in Brooklyn, to Mr. Guss and Mr. Karlson, would like to know which speakers you prefer between the University Senior 2, the Jensen TF3, and the KLH-10. KLH-10. Oh, that's the, yes.
Is that the small job?
That's their $89 one, yes. Yeah.
$89. I heard that the other day.
That's not a bad sounding speaker.
It's not a bad sound. In fact, I like it better than some of the more expensive.
I like it better than the University myself.
bookshelf
The
speakers.
KLH is a very musical speaker. It's a natural sound.
Ray Lofsted, excuse me if I don't pronounce your name right, would like to know, why does NCN on a medium quality FM set give a better signal than what? I guess than a high quality FM set. Does the station not modulate fully? Opinion. FM stations not as good as they should be. I don't know. FM stations are giving you, if they are complying or following what the FCC says you must be capable of broadcasting, will give you, as WNCN does, 50 to 15,000 cycles. Anything more than that they can't properly handle because of the high frequency energy on the records, and it tends to overmodulate their transmitter and everything else, and things melt and nobody gets a good signal. Why does WNCN sound better on a medium quality FM set? For that you'll have to speak to Marty next week.
Sounds fine on my high quality FM set. I'm using the Card Crystal. Beautiful.
Second part of his question, would two good speaker systems of different manufacture be better or worse than matched speakers?
I feel that two good quality, if you're going to get good quality speakers, match them.
Match them.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is sort of the accepted standard today. If you're going to get a pair of loudspeakers, buy a pair, not one in one price bracket and one in the other, and have such a big difference between them.
One may denigrate the other.
Very
or you could
true.
argue the better one will pull up the other.
Sure. Well, this happens frequently.
Yeah.
You get one that carry the other on the bass.
Right. And you have the satellite technique, where you have the fine speaker in the middle and two high-frequency units on either side.
Dr. Klein in Manhattan is considering the purchase of a used ICO HFS2. What do you gentlemen think of this speaker, and how does it compare with more conventional designs? This one, if I am not mistaken, was the tall, thin one that had the ice cream cone tweeter and the slotted bass with a Stu Hageman design.
It's a reasonably good sound.
I haven't heard it, I couldn't comment.
It's based on his Hageman Pro, or his Hageman.
I respect Hageman. He said some things that make sense. Like there's very little correlation between specs and what you hear.
A question directed to Mr. Karlson. If the quality of the enclosure is so important, how can a firm take a chance on having a speaker enclosure, I imagine, assembled by the customer?
Our enclosures are assembled quite readily. We sell them in kit form, and our instructions are quite simple. And quite a few speaker manufacturers have the opportunity of reviewing our units, and by and large they recommend them very highly. And ordinarily the requirement is that an enclosure should be closely matched to a speaker. In a sense, this is true if you are speaking of the normal enclosure designs, such as infinite baffle, bass reflex, and so on. However, with our unit, it is possible to put a great variety of speakers in our enclosures and get superior sound, even beyond the specifications originally designed for the speaker by the original manufacturer. We've done this in competition, and we know that this is true.
If you gentlemen are ready, I am going to pick the questions here which deal with the topic we discussed earlier in the evening, which is loudspeakers, Argus, and AR. And Byron Mogul states, if AR is nothing special, why is AR the only speaker manufacturer to consistently hold live versus recorded demonstrations?
Well, I must repeat that 3/4 of the speakers now available, for psychological reasons, would give you virtually the same results in live versus speaker performance.
But then why are they the only ones who do this? Why doesn't KLH do this? Why
Because,
don't-
KLH, in my opinion, is a much better designed AR. It's much more musical. Again, I'm doing it. But if I have to give Vilcher credit for being a magnificent salesman. If others did it, they get very much the same results.
The only reason I wouldn't do it, or would hesitate doing it, is because of the cost.
Yeah, I can't afford it.
Yeah, that's very
I
true.
couldn't afford the cost of 3 large rooms in a
that noise.
hi-fi show at approximately $2,000, $2,500, plus an orchestra, plus all the recording equipment and whatnot.
Yeah, it does run into money.
Our business just wouldn't tolerate it.
Yes.
But even the bigger speaker manufacturers that can afford it just didn't think about it.
And he has a statement, and I quote, KLH-4 was top-rated speaker in Consumer's Report. KLH speaker rated smoothest of all speakers tested. AR1 was rated just below KLH-4 by virtue of its superior bass only. AR2 was the 4th rated speaker with the statement that there was a hole in the upper mid-range. So why then did not KLH sell millions of dollars worth of speakers that year?
The AR article came out in advance of the KLH one. Is that not right?
Yeah, sure. They got the jump on the rest of the industry.
That KLH-4 is a fine speaker. And as far as I'm concerned, when Consumers Union is right, that's an excellent.
Mr. Gullman, some controversy between Consumers Report article. Mr. Guss stated he likes KLH-4s, yet he's criticizing the article. And again, probably repeating what was said there. Yet article rated it the best speaker and gave AR good reviews. What do you think of the KLH?
The KLH-4 is a great speaker. Now, when I review my shelf speaker, I'll demonstrate it alongside the KLH. It's much more efficient, so I cripple my speaker with a T-pad, knock the volume down. My speaker sounds like a KLH-4, only I feel I get still better transient response and still more definition and delineation of instruments. But as far as musical quality of the KLH-4, I feel it's equivalent to my shelf speaker in musical quality.
Mr. Polk in Jersey City says he will make every effort to listen to Argus and Karlson and evaluate them on his own. Probably the best way around to do it.
Sure.
You know, you can
Open
listen
house.
to us and listen to these gentlemen here, extol the virtues of their speakers, and then you go down and listen to it and say, these two guys are nuts. You know.
Well, I know for myself I'm not anyhow. To be in this industry.
Well, it helps.
You have to be.
Byron Mogul in Manhattan has heard the Argus-X 5 speaker. It gives unenthusiastic separation of instruments as well as a pinched instrumental quality because of upper mid-range overemphasis. Speaking of separation, how does one separate the music from record surface noise with this speaker?
Stereophile published a report on the tweeter section of my speakers, called it one of the sweetest sounding, best dispersion patterns, also indicated there was less surface noise on these tweeters than virtually any others in the field. Suggested too that it had an even more open quality than the KLH, although it likes the KLH enormously.
If you have just tuned in, this is not the John Karlson Reuben Guss show. This is the Hi-Fi Workbench on WNCN-FM in New York. 104.3 on your FM dial. Our phone numbers for your questions on high fidelity, Plaza 20870. We have all our lines open at the present time. My name is Eric Toline. With me tonight, John Karlson, President of KRC Corporation, and Reuben Guss, President of the Argus-X Electronics. A question for Mr. Karlson from John Adams in Brooklyn. Have you heard the GOUGH, or GO, G-O-U-G-H enclosure, which is based on the principle of reflected sound? What are your thoughts on this particular enclosure?
Well, first of all, I hadn't heard it. And, so it's very difficult to make any comment on it.
I'm not familiar with him. I don't know.
Mr. Anapol.
But if you don't ask questions, how do you expect to learn?
That's right. Hang around, you'll learn. Mr. Anapol states the AR3 is proven to be an extremely flat-sounding speaker system. It has also been proven to be a system of extremely uncolored sound. When a flat speaker system is compared to a speaker colored open in most frequencies, in most cases on first hearing, colored or peaked speaker sounds more spectacular than flat system. So, if the AR sounds less spectacular than Argus-X, presume that Argus-X is colored in most frequencies. Did you understand what
I understood what you were saying, what he was what he had thrown in. Do you wish to comment first, John?
Well, this question of color and
a sound of its own.
Like a color, sound of its own. This term has had a considerable amount of misuse or use, depending on how you look at it. But you take a low efficiency speaker as compared to the high efficiency speakers. Suppose they're both equally flat. Say there was both of them were so flat that there would be no difference in the flatness of response. Now, their sound qualities, however, would be widely different. A high efficiency speaker would give you detail in both the high dynamic ranges and very soft low dynamic range. It will give you detail and definition of full orchestral passages. For example, in the last hi-fi show, I was listening to some of these speakers, low efficiency speakers, and being a choir director, I was interested in choir music. Now, I found that I lost a great deal of the detail in the background voices. I only heard the most prominent voices. Mm-hmm. And I knew that the background voices should be there, but they just weren't. Now, this means that a low efficiency speaker is producing the loudest sounds and dropping out the weakest sounds. It's also acting to compress high dynamic range. So, therefore, a reviewer might say that, the high efficiency speaker sounds colored, whereas the other speaker sounds flat. Now, this is the use of semantics in some of these reports. And therefore, the best way of judging these things should be go out and listen to these speakers and judge their naturalness. See how much detail. See if you can pick out the various instruments in their various parts and see if you can follow those instruments. If you can't, there's something missing.
Well, I just
I have an answer too for it.
One statement to that. I'm sure you gentlemen agree that the room in which you listen to a loudspeaker adds a lot to the sound that it reproduces. A room has its own reflective surfaces and absorbent surfaces. Would you say then that the best place to test any loudspeakers for quality or coloration or lack of it is out in an open field where there are no reflective surfaces?
That's the best way to test it with a test microphone and an oscilloscope. I'd like to answer this question. It was addressed to me and comparing it to the Argus. And I was very happy with John's answer too. This is the effect you get in a direct comparison test with the Argus speaker versus the AR3. Instruments and the AR3 do seem to drop out, especially at low volumes, but even given a healthy volume, they're not as well delineated. That's one thing. Also, there seems to be a vast piece of propaganda which seems to have caught hold to justify the fact that it drops out. Do you know Mr. White, W-H-Y-T-E? I met him at the audio show, and he was speaking to, should I mention names? I'm afraid again. Mr. Hirschhoek. And we asked Hirschhoek what he thought the best speaker was, and he said AR3. Mr. White said, I should not say what Mr. White said. At any rate...
There are limits of propriety.
Yes,
just say
with
this.
propriety I cannot say it. Exactly.
All right.
At any rate, the impression
we'll report
is
to you next week when I find out after the show what he said, and we'll edit it down.
The point is this. Some people will rationalize a low-efficiency speaker and say, well, I like to feel I'm sitting in the back row. The only answer I can provide, and Mr. White also suggested this answer, that if you want to sit in the back row and miss most of the instrumentation, fine. But that's not the job of a loudspeaker. A loudspeaker's job is to authentically recreate the signal it receives. If much of that signal gets lost somewhere, the job is not being done by this loudspeaker.
Well, just commenting on that.
In other words, if the information is there and just doesn't show up on the speaker, there's something wrong with the speaker. And no amount of propaganda is going to change this. You can always justify it and say, well, it's very neutral, and therefore you have to listen a long time before you like it, and so on.
Yeah, I think the big
now,
fallacy...
it's true, a bright speaker may be shrieking If the highs are not proper, it may blare, violins may sound like they're in a steel case, everything may sound brassy. That is not good. It may sound more impressive. In this respect, I do agree with him. But if the speaker is natural, and the instruments are authentic, you'll know it. And I'm willing to run this test as often as you like, with as many different records as you like. Listen, see if you hear the instruments, see if they drop out. See if they sound natural.
John?
Yeah, well, another popular notion is that you can compensate for the efficiency of a speaker by having a very powerful amplifier. This is not true. We've taken our speaker systems, for example. We have audible output at 1/2 of 1 microwatt. Others will drop out much higher at higher levels than that. And
in other words, if you blow into the wire with yours, you can just about hear it at the other end.
Just about. In other words, you're speaking this. But just this gets down to the amount of energy, say, that is in the voice. Well, we can practically duplicate the sound that is by the energy in a voice. And now, if you take an inefficient speaker, it requires just so much drive to get it going. It's just sticky. It's a sticky speaker. And you have to be above a certain level in order to get effective output. And this is the difference. It sounds difference why one of these speakers will sound flat and another speaker will sound colored, because it will give all the detail.
Here's another thing. If you know Warren's voice and Bjorn's voice, bring your records, and we'll see, if you've heard them in person, which is the authentic voice and which is the voice in the box. Another thing is to efficiency. We have efficiency. I have people who drive my big speakers off the Tandberg, 4 watts per channel. I'll drive any one of my Argus speakers off a clock radio at considerable volume.
I'll tell you one better. We drove ours off a small transistor radio.
I haven't tried it.
With 14 microwatts output.
I do that all the time.
But a high efficiency speaker.
Transistor radio, my Jim Lansing's. Yeah. Speaking of loudspeakers, Ted Meyer would like to know our opinion on the Bozak B4000. Is the bass response good? He read an article in Hi-Fi Stereo that response isn't too good.
It's awesome, but is it defined is the question. I have mixed feelings about the Bozak.
Let's keep them short. We have about 7 minutes and about 27 questions.
Well, I like them anyhow, and yet I don't know about definition in the bass. There are times they can sound muddy. Again, it's a problem in baffling, etc. Okay, you have to live with that.
A fast comment for Mr. Vanalest in Kew Gardens. Thank you. A comment on the EMI 630 loudspeaker.
May I quote from Stereophile?
Why not?
Virtually verbatim. The EMI is no danger to anyone, perhaps, in this demonstration, to anyone but the manufacturer. Highs are piercingly strident. Something seems to be overloading in the bass every time a heavy bass note comes along. Unquote.
I have one comment, and then I'll get right back to you, John. Mr. Zitz in Upper Fieldstone Road, Riverdale, thinks comments made by gentlemen about flatness and coloration are about best comments he's heard. He also would like to know, as an addendum, what do you think of the Lansing Hartsfield and high-frequency horn used in it, which is the JBL 537 or 509? You know the Hartsfield, the big corner enclosure?
That gives a very nice sound. And
it's big sound.
That lens system will give you good dispersion within about 90 degrees.
John, you had something you wanted to mention.
Yeah, well, we've been talking about the use of hi-fi for home applications. Well, I'd like to announce that now hi-fi stereo is possible in commercial sound. And we've developed a new ceiling unit that makes it possible to have stereo in all restaurants, offices, and whatnot. This is a entirely new field of endeavor for the hi-fi industry. We have very few PA amplifiers or commercial amplifiers that are equipped for stereo. We have, however, this speaker makes it possible to have stereo in commercial establishments, restaurants, and so on.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that just one will cover as much as 2,400 square feet. Two of them will do a stereo in the entire area, with the stereo image being constant regardless of where you might sit or stand in that space. So this is an entirely new aspect for the entire hi-fi industry, and anyone who's interested in learning more details, they can send to our organization, Box 117, West Hempstead, New York.
I have a question that's directed to me from Charles Blunt in Brooklyn. A little plug never hurt. KRC, Argus-X. Right, there you go. This question is directed to me. It says, what enclosures with JBL speaker? I assume he means mine. I use a modified Alltech Lansing caramel enclosures with two 15-inch woofers, two JBL D216 mid-ranges, two 075s, and two Wharfdale 800 5000 three-way crossover, 800 5000 cycle three-way crossovers, and I think they're great. Mr. Joseph, we have 4 minutes. We'll knock off as many as we can. If we can't knock them off tonight or finish off the 30-odd questions, see if we can't have them finished next week. Ray Tannoy, EMI Bozak.